He called me a beggar in the foyer of a mansion I secretly paid for. He thought the old man in the scuffed work boots was just a stain on his perfect image, a relic to be hidden away in a back room, while he drank scotch purchased with my stolen money. He forgot that before you can build a skyscraper, you have to dig a hole deep enough to bury the weak. He was about to learn that I don't just pour concrete, I bury men in it. Metaphorically speaking, of course. If you're listening to this, hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. It helps to know there are still people out little there who respect an honest day's work. Julian thought he was the architect of his own fortune, but he didn't realize he was standing on a trapdoor I had installed 30 years ago, and I was about to pull the lever. It started on a Tuesday evening that felt less like a dinner and more like a demolition. The rain didn't just fall, it assaulted the earth. It hammered against the metal roof of my 2004 Ford sedan like 1,000 tiny knuckles, frantic and rhythmic, demanding to be let in. Inside the cabin, the world was gray and muffled, smelling of old oil, stale coffee, and the damp wool of my jacket. I sat in the driveway, the engine idling with a rough rhythmic shudder. It was a vibration I knew well, a misfiring cylinder, a slight imbalance in the crankshaft. It vibrated up through the worn leather seat, bypassing the flesh and drilling straight into my spine. A younger man would have been annoyed. I found comfort in it. It was mechanical, fixable, unlike the problems waiting for me inside the fortress of glass and steel looming ahead. I gripped the steering wheel. My hands were landscape maps of a life spent building. The knuckles were swollen, the skin callous and rough, etched with the white scars of slipped chisels and rebar burns. To the casual observer, these were the hands of a laborer. They had laid bricks in the freezing dawn. They had poured concrete until their muscles screamed, but they had also signed contracts worth billions. They had shaken hands with presidents. They had drawn the blueprints that changed the skyline of this city. You wouldn't know it looking at me today. To the world, and to the people inside that house, I was just Arthur, an old man in a rusting car, clinging to the edges of relevance. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The face staring back was a topography of 60 years. Deep grooves ran from my nose to my mouth, stress fractures in the concrete of my expression. My hair was gray, thinning at the temples, surrendering to time. My eyes, usually sharp enough to spot a hairline crack in a support beam from 50 yards, looked tired today. They held the quiet, heavy look of a man who has buried too many things. But it was the suit that drew my attention. Charcoal gray wool, double-breasted, with wide lapels that screamed of a bygone era. I had bought it 25 years ago. The fabric at the elbows shone with the friction of age. On the left cuff, there was a small, almost invisible mend. I ran my thumb over the stitching. I had snagged it on a jagged piece of rebar at the Site 4 project in 1998. My late wife, Martha, had stitched it up herself, sitting under the yellow light of our kitchen table. I could almost hear her voice, cutting through the drumming rain.
It gives it character, Arthur.
Never be ashamed of the dust on your clothes. It means you did the work. It means you built something. Martha was gone. The silence she left behind was louder than any jackhammer. This suit, smelling faintly of lavender in old closets, was all I had left to wrap around me. It was my armor. Dad? The voice broke my reverie. I turned. My daughter Lily sat in the passenger seat. She was twisting the strap of her seatbelt, wrapping the nylon webbing around her fingers until the tips turned white. It was a nervous tic she had developed recently, a sign of structural instability. She looked beautiful in her navy dress, the fabric modest and elegant, but her face was pale, drained of blood. Her eyes darted toward the massive house in front of us. It was a monolith of modern architecture, cold, imposing, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. "Are you okay, sweetie?"
Oh.
I asked. My voice was low, gravelly. It was the voice I used to calm panic foremen when cranes stalled in high winds, or when the ground shifted unexpectedly. I tried to inject warmth into it, to shore up her crumbling resolve. I'm nervous," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the front door. "Julian's parents, the Drakes. They can be intense," she added, her voice barely audible over the rain. "They care a lot about presentation, optics." She looked down at her lap, unable to meet my eyes. Julian says his mother, Eleanor, judges people by their shoes before they even speak. Slowly, involuntarily, her eyes drifted down to my feet. I was wearing heavy, scuffed work boots. The leather was stained with the residue of 1,000 job sites. They were functional, waterproof, and safe. They were not, however, Italian leather. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. The plea was vibrating in the air between us. Please don't embarrass me. I forced a smile. It felt tight, unnatural. It didn't reach my eyes. A man is measured by his word, Lily, I said gently. Not his wool, and certainly not his leather. If Julian loves you, I continued, watching her profile, he won't care about an old man's fashion. He'll care about the man who raised the woman he loves. I hoped that was true, but my gut, honed by decades of sensing danger on construction sites, told me otherwise. The air felt heavy, charged with static. I know, she sighed, finally releasing the seatbelt strap. But Julian is under so much pressure. The wedding, the promotion. She looked out at the mansion again. He says his boss at Helios is a tyrant, she added. A dinosaur who refuses to modernize. Even though he's never met him, she continued, shaking her head. He just wants tonight to be perfect. He feels like he's walking on a tightrope. I tightened my grip on the wheel. My knuckles turned stark white. Julian worked for Helios Construction. My company. He called me a tyrant, a dinosaur. The audacity was breathless. He had no idea who was sitting in this car. He had no idea that the dinosaur had built the very platform Julian was standing on. I took a slow breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I had to remain the variable they couldn't calculate. I had to be the ghost in the machine. Let's go, I said, my voice final. I turned the key. The engine sputtered and died. The silence that rushed into the car was sudden and heavy, pressing against my eardrums. It was time. We stepped out into the deluge. The transition from the stale warmth of the car to the biting reality of the storm was instant. I fumbled with the latch of a large black umbrella, an industrial-grade thing I kept in the trunk, and snapped it open with a hollow thwump. I held it high, angling it to shield Lily completely. The cold rain immediately found the weakness in my defense, soaking my left shoulder and seeping into the wool of my suit. The wind was predatory. It bit through the thin fabric, seeking the warmth of my skin. I didn't flinch. I had stood on suspension bridges in freezing gales. I had walked the skeletal frames of skyscrapers in January. This was nothing but weather. We walked up the long path. The house didn't just loom. It glared. Up close it was a monolith of aggressive wealth, sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling glass, and cold, brushed steel. It looked expensive, certainly, but to my eye, it looked sterile. It looked like a weapon designed to make people feel small. But as we neared the porch, the engineer in me took over. My eyes, trained to find faults in things that looked perfect, dropped to the ground. The driveway pavers were slate, imported and undoubtedly pricey, but they were uneven. The grout lines were spiderwebbing with hairline fractures. I tapped my boot against a loose edge, improper subgrade preparation. I diagnosed instantly. They rushed the foundation for a family that prided itself on absolute perfection, on the ruthless curation of their image. The ground they walked on was already failing. Wrote beneath the gilt, I thought. It was a detail only a builder would notice, and it gave me a strange, cold comfort. I rang the doorbell. It wasn't a buzz. It was a melody. Something classical, needlessly complex. A minor chord that lingered in the damp air. We waited through the massive oak door. I could hear laughter. It was a specific kind of sound, low, resonant, confident. The sound of people who have never had to worry if the check would clear. It sounded warm, rich, exclusive. Then the lock clicked, a heavy, decisive sound, and the door swung open. Julian stood there. He was 30, but he wore his ambition like a uniform. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way. High cheekbones, manicured stubble, hairstyled with geometric precision. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, the satin lapels catching the foyer light. In his right hand he held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. Scotch, single malt, likely older than Lily. He smiled at my daughter. a flash of white teeth, practiced and dazzling. "Babe, you made it," he exclaimed, the warmth in his hisses sounding almost genuine. Then his eyes slid to the left. To me, the transformation was immediate and chilling. The smile didn't just fade, it curdled. It was like watching a light bulb burn out. He looked at my wet shoulder, the dark stain spreading on the gray wool. He looked at the umbrella dripping onto his porch. His gaze traveled down to my heavy, scuffed work boots, crusted with the mud of the real world. And finally, he looked at the charcoal suit with the wide lapels. "Oh," Julian said. The syllable hung in the air, heavy with disappointment. His voice had lost its musicality. It was now loud, performative, meant for the audience inside as much as for us. "Here comes our beggar father-in-law." I felt Lily stiffen beside me. It was a physical reaction, a flinch, as if he had raised a hand. "Julian, stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." She sounded humiliated, shrinking into herself. "I'm just joking, babe." He chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. His eyes remained dead cold, fixed on mine. He blocked the doorway with his body, a gatekeeper deciding if the rabble was worthy of entry. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly. "But seriously, Arthur," he said, shaking his head, "I hope you'll wear a different suit to the wedding. I mean, really." "Hey, blah." He gestured vaguely at my chest with his glass. "This one looks like it came from the trash, or a museum exhibit on the Great Depression." The war had started, and I hadn't even wiped my feet. The insult hung in the wet air like a physical blow. A younger Arthur might have clenched a fist. The Arthur standing there, the CEO who had negotiated with unions and cartels, simply analyzed him. I looked for cracks in his confidence the way I looked for fractures in concrete. He was arrogant. That was obvious. But under the arrogance, there was insecurity. He needed to belittle me to elevate himself. He was a small man in a big house. "It's a good suit," I said calmly. My voice was gravel against his smooth, polished world. It was the sound of earth and stone. "It's kept me warm through worse storms than this." "I'm sure it has." A woman's voice drifted from the hallway, sharp and cutting. Julian stepped aside, and his mother, Eleanor, stepped into view. She was a striking woman, preserved by money and bitterness. She wore a floor-length silver gown that shimmered like fish scales. Diamonds, large, heavy stones, dripped from her neck and ears. She looked at me, not with hatred, but with a profound, weary distaste, as if I were a muddy dog that had wandered onto her porch and refused to leave. "Well, don't just stand there letting the heat out," she snapped. "Come in, but please." She paused, her eyes snapping down to my feet. "Leave those boots on the mat outside. We just had the marble imported from Italy. It stains if you look at it wrong." I looked at Lily. She was pleading with her eyes. "Just do it, Dad. Please." I swallowed my pride. It tasted like bile. Slowly, painfully, I bent down. My knees popped, a sound loud enough to be heard in the sudden silence. I unlaced the heavy boots, my fingers stiff from the cold. I set them on the mat, side by side. Without them, I felt shorter, vulnerable. I stepped onto the marble in my socks. They were thick, gray wool socks, functional, warm. But on the heel of the left one, the fabric had worn through. A circle of pale skin was visible. A small hole. I saw Julian nudge his father, Richard, who had appeared behind Eleanor like a silent shadow. Richard was holding a glass of red wine, looking bored. They pointed at the hole. Julian covered his mouth to hide a smirk, but the sound escaped. A wet, condescending snicker. Richard shook his head, a gesture of mock pity. They exchanged a look that said everything. "Look at him. He can't even afford whole socks." I stood up, feeling the cold stone through the wool. I met Julian's eyes. "Laugh while you can, boy," I thought, the internal voice cold and hard as steel. "The bill always comes due, and the interest is compounding by the second." "Shall we?" I asked, my voice steady. Julian smirked, gesturing grandly toward the interior of the beast. "Enter the kingdom, Arthur. Try not to break anything." We walked into the living room, a space so vast it felt less like a home, and more like a hotel lobby designed to impress strangers. The ceiling vaulted 20 feet overhead, lost in shadows that the chandeliers couldn't reach. On the far wall, a fireplace of dressed limestone roared with a fire big enough to roast a pig. The heat was aggressive, blasting against the chill that still clung to my damp suit, but it offered no comfort. It was a dry, consuming heat. Eleanor moved to a high-backed velvet armchair, settling into it with the practiced grace of a monarch claiming her throne. She smoothed her silver dress, her eyes already scanning me for the next flaw. "So," she began, her tone conversational but sharp, like a scalpel hidden in a bouquet. "Lily tells us you're retired, Arthur. What did you do, exactly?" "Construction?" I stood near the fire, trying to dry my trousers without drawing attention to the steam rising from the wool. "Yes," I said simply. "I built things." "A laborer," Julian corrected instantly. He was perched on the arm of Lily's chair, looming over her. He draped his arm around her shoulders, his fingers digging slightly into her clavicle. It wasn't an embrace, it was a claim. Possession. "Look what I bought," the gesture said. "He laid bricks," Julian continued, addressing his parents as if I were a deaf exhibit. "Heavy lifting, cement mixing. That's why his hands look like that." He gestured toward my hands, which were clasped loosely in front of me. "Honest work," I said. My voice was low, rumbling in my chest. "Low work," Julian countered smoothly, swirling his scotch. "See, Arthur, that's the difference between us. That's the evolution of the species." He took a sip, his eyes glinting with the scotch's amber reflection. "You work with your back. You trade sweat for pennies. I work with my mind." He tapped his temple with a manicured forefinger. "I'm a senior project manager at Helios. I move pieces on a board. I control millions of dollars in logistics and supply chains. I don't get dirty." I watched him. I watched the way he preened, the way he looked at his father for approval. He was a child playing with matches in a powder keg. "Is that so?" I asked, keeping my face a mask of polite ignorance. "Helios is a good company. I've heard good things. They have strict ethics." Julian laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Ethics? Please. Arthur, you're so quaint." He leaned forward, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, acting as if he were explaining quantum physics to a toddler. "That's for the brochures. That's for the shareholders. And the public relations team. In the real world," he said, his smile stretching tight, "it's about result. It's about green on the spreadsheet. The owner, some old dinosaur named Clay, is never around." Julian scoffed, dismissing the name with a wave of his hand. "He's a ghost, probably senile in some Swiss chalet. We run the and as long as the numbers look green, nobody asks how the sausage is made." My heart skipped a beat. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. Nobody asks how the sausage is made. That was a phrase I hated. In my industry, when a project manager used that phrase, it didn't mean efficiency. It meant corners were being cut. It meant safety inspections were being bribed. It meant the structural integrity of a building was being compromised for a quarterly bonus. I wasn't a dinosaur. I was the hunter. And he had just walked into the center of my crosshairs. "And you're doing well," I probed gently, playing the part of the impressed, simple old man. "Better than well," Julian smirked. "I'm up for a promotion to regional director next week. Once that happens, I'll be untouchable. Complete autonomy. That's wonderful." "Julian," Lily piped up. Her voice was thin, desperate to cut the tension, to normalize the cruelty happening in front of her. "Dad, Julian has been working so hard on the Riverfront project." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The Riverfront project, my pet project. The legacy build. It was supposed to be a revitalized community center and affordable housing complex on the East Bank. It was designed to be safe, sustainable, a gift to the city that had made me. "The Riverfront?" I asked, allowing a frown to crease my forehead. "I read about that. I heard there were delays, something about the foundation pouring. The soil tests were inconclusive." Julian's eyes narrowed. The arrogance faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by suspicion. "How would you know that?" he snapped. "You read the trade papers?" "I keep up," I said softly. I like to know what's being built in my city. A man likes to know the ground he walks on is solid. Yeah, well, the papers don't know half of it, Julian bragged, his ego overriding his caution. He wanted to show off his power to the bricklayer. He wanted to prove he was the smarter man. The ground was unstable, Julian admitted, leaning back. Liquefaction potential in the subgrade. The engineers, cowards, all of them, wanted to spend another $2 million on deep pile reinforcements. They wanted to delay the pour by 3 months. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. And, I asked. I told them to pour it anyway, Julian said, grinning. I overrode the engineer. We used a standard spread footing, saved the company a fortune, and kept us on schedule. My hands tightened into fists behind my back. He had poured concrete on unstable ground. He had ignored the load-bearing calculations. If that building settled when it settled, it wouldn't just crack. It could collapse. He wasn't just a jerk. He wasn't just a bad fiancé. He was a criminal. He was gambling with human lives to buy a better seat at the table. Isn't that dangerous? I asked. My voice was tighter now, the gravel grinding together. If the soil shifts, risk is part of the game, old man. Julian interrupted, dismissing me with a flick of his wrist. That's why I drive a Porsche and you drive whatever that rattletrap outside is. I take the risks you're too scared to take. He stood up, clapping his hands together. The sound was like a gunshot. Now let's talk about the wedding. Let's eat. He began to walk toward the dining room, expecting us to follow like obedient dogs. He was talking about a party. He was thinking about his bonus. I was thinking about prison cells. I was thinking about the physics of a collapsing slab. I was thinking about how much pressure it takes to break a man who thinks he is made of steel. I followed him. The hunger in my stomach was gone, replaced by a different kind of appetite. The game was no longer about respect. It was about survival. And Julian didn't even know he was already dead. We moved to the dining room, a chamber that felt less like a place for sustenance and more like a boardroom designed for hostile takeovers. The table was a long, dark slab of polished mahogany, stretching out under a crystal chandelier that cast a fractured, prismatic light. It was set with enough silverware to confuse a king, forks within forks, spoons of varying depths, crystal glasses arranged like transparent sentinels. I was directed to a seat opposite Richard. It was the position of the accused. Lily was seated next to Julian, placed there like a trophy on a shelf. She looked smaller in the high-backed chair, her shoulders hunched, diminishing by the minute. But as I sat, pulling the heavy chair in, my peripheral vision caught movement near the kitchen door. A woman in a catering uniform, white button-down, black vest, hair pulled back tight, was moving around the table with a pitcher of water. She moved with an efficiency that was out of place. Most catering staff in houses like this moved with fear. She moved with purpose. It was Elena. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and cold, hit my bloodstream. Elena wasn't a waitress. She was one of my best site inspectors, a woman who could spot a hairline fracture in a steel girder from 50 feet away. I had placed her deep undercover 2 weeks ago, when the first whispers of corruption on the riverfront project had reached my desk. She approached my side. Her face was a mask of servitude, eyes downcast. She poured water into my crystal goblet. The ice crackled. As she leaned in to wipe a non-existent drop from the table, her lips barely moved. The whisper was lighter than a breath, audible only to me. The study, laptop, folder read. I didn't react. I didn't blink. I simply gave a micronod, a twitch of the chin that a casual observer would mistake for a tremor of age. She moved away, vanishing into the shadows of the kitchen like a ghost. Folder read. The target was acquired. The proof was in the house. The game had shifted from defense to offense, but I still had to survive the meal. Arthur, try this, Richard said, his voice booming across the expanse of mahogany. He held a decanter, pouring a dark, heavy liquid into his own glass, then Julian's, then Eleanor's. But when he reached for my glass, he set the decanter down and picked up a different bottle. A screw top that had been sitting on the sidebar, he splashed a generous amount into my glass. The liquid was a lighter shade of red, thin and watery at the edges. It's a Cabernet, Richard said, sliding the glass toward me. Do you like it? I lifted the glass. The nose was aggressive, vinegar and sugar. I took a small sip. It was mostagal, harsh, with the distinct chemical aftertaste of mass production. It was the kind of wine sold for $5 at a gas station. They were drinking a vintage that likely cost more than my car. They had served me the swill. It has a distinct bouquet, I said, setting the glass down gently. A sharp finish. It's from a box. Richard laughed, a wheezing sound that shook his jowls. He looked at Julian, sharing the joke. I figured you wouldn't want to waste the vintage stuff. Palates like yours, well, they tend to prefer quantity over quality, right? You're used to beer, I assume. Richard, Eleanor chided, though her eyes danced with amusement. Be polite. I kept my hand on the table, palm flat against the cold wood. Silence, I told myself. Silence is louder than shouting. Here is the situation, Arthur. Eleanor began, pivoting instantly to business. She sliced her steak with surgical precision, the knife screeching faintly against the china. We need to discuss the wedding logistics. We are inviting the city's elite, she continued, not looking at me. Senators, CEO, the entire board of directors from Helios Construction will be in attendance. It is the social event of the season. She paused, spearing a piece of meat. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over my worn suit, my weathered face, my silent defiance. We cannot have this representing the bride's family. We understand that times are tough for people like you, Richard added, leaning back. The economy, inflation, it hits the working class hard. So, we have a proposal. He pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket. He placed it on the table. We will pay for the wedding. All of it. The venue, the catering, the dress, the flowers. You won't have to spend a dime of your savings. That's very generous, I said slowly. The trap was open. I could see the spikes at the bottom. However, Julian interjected, his mouth full. He swallowed, wiping his lips with a linen napkin. There is a condition. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, invading the center space. You won't sit at the head table. The room was still. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. In fact, Julian continued, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather, we'd prefer if you didn't sit in the main hall at all. Clatter. Lily's fork hit her plate. The sound was sharp, violent. What? She asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. We have a private room reserved, Julian explained, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the theoretical venue. For extended family. Cousins, distant relatives. You can eat there. It's very nice. Same menu, and for the photos? Eleanor added, taking a sip of her expensive wine, you'll stand in the back row. Way back, or perhaps just assist with the organization. Julian, Lily said. Her voice shook, rising in pitch. She looked at him as if she were seeing a stranger. You can't ask my dad to hide at my own wedding. I'm protecting him, Lil. Julian snapped, his facade of patience cracking. Do you want the vice president of Helios to ask your dad why he's wearing a suit from 1990? Do you want him asking about bricklaying while we're trying to close deals? He looked at me with undisguised disgust. He doesn't fit, Lily. He's a smudge on a perfect picture. I watched my daughter. I saw the tears welling in her eyes, hot and fast. I saw the shame not for me, but for herself. For having brought me here, for having loved a man this cruel. I won't do it, Lily said. She was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. If Dad can't sit with me, if he isn't by my side, then there is no wedding. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a structure that had just lost a load-bearing wall. Julian turned to Lily. His face twisted, the handsome mask dissolved, revealing something ugly and snarling beneath. He reached under the table. I saw his shoulder dip. He grabbed her wrist. I saw Lily wince, a sharp intake of breath. Don't you dare threaten me, Julian hissed. His voice was a venomous whisper. I am the one giving you this life, he growled, squeezing her wrist. I am the one paying for this house, this food, your future. You think your beggar father can give you this? He squeezed harder. Lily let out a small, pained whimper. Julian, you're hurting me, she gasped. I said. Julian leaned in, his eyes wide and manic. Know your place. The world narrowed down to that grip. To his hand on my daughter, the engineer in me vanished. The CEO vanished. Only the father remained, and the father was dangerous. Let go of her hand, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't stand up. I spoke with a voice I hadn't used in 20 years. It was the voice that had commanded 500 men to stop working when a cable snapped. It was a voice that cut through steel and concrete. It was absolute. Julian froze. He looked at me, blinking. He was surprised by the tone, the sudden shift from submissive old man to apex predator. He let go of Lily's hand. Excuse me? He laughed nervously, looking at his parents for support. Did the beggar speak? I said, let go. I repeated. I stared into his eyes. I let him see the abyss. I let him see the man who had buried a wife, built a city, and survived things that would break him in half. And never, I said, enunciating every syllable, touch her in anger again, or what? Julian challenged. The ego was fighting back, desperate to regain control. He leaned forward, his face inches from the centerpiece. Know your place, Arthur. You are here because I allow it. You are eating my food. You are breathing my air. I held his gaze. I didn't blink. I needed the proof. I needed what was on that laptop, in the study. I had to leave this table before I did something that would land me in jail, before I could destroy him legally. I need to use the restroom, I said abruptly. The tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. The non sequitur confused him. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I didn't wait for permission. I turned and walked out of the dining room. But I didn't head for the restroom. I turned left, toward the study, toward folder red, toward the end of Julian's world. I left the dining room, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind me, sealing the toxicity inside. The hallway was dimmer than the dining area, lit by sconces that cast long, gothic shadows against the silk wallpaper. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from the cold, sharp focus of the job. I had walked steel beams, 60 stories up, with less adrenaline than this. This wasn't construction, this was demolition, and I was the charge. I moved silently. My socks, the source of their ridicule, were now my tactical advantage. On the marble floor I was a ghost. I passed a row of portraits. Stern men in waistcoats, women in bonnets. Ancestors bought at an auction, no doubt, to give the Drakes a history they hadn't earned. The house was quiet, save for the relentless drumming of the rain against the high windows, a constant reminder of the storm outside and the storm within. I reached the study. The door was ajar, spilling a slice of warm amber light onto the corridor floor. I paused, listening. No voices, no movement. I pushed the door open with a single finger and slipped inside. The room was a cliché of masculine power. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound albums that had likely never been cracked. The smell of expensive cigar smoke and lemon polish hung heavy in the air. In the center of the room sat a massive desk, an expanse of ebony wood, and there it was. The laptop was open, the screen glowing with a spreadsheet. Beside it, a bright red folder red. Elena hadn't been speaking in code. She was literal. I took a step toward the desk. Lost, old man? The voice came from the shadows in the corner, deep and scratching like sandpaper on stone. I froze. I didn't turn immediately. I calibrated the voice, distance 10 feet. Direction, the high-backed leather chair near the window. Tone, bored but dangerous. I turned slowly, affecting the posture of the confused geriatric. A man was sitting there, shrouded in the gloom. He was massive, a wall of muscle, squeezed into a black suit that cost more than my truck, but fit him poorly. His head was shaved bald, gleaming in the low light. A scar, white and jagged, ran from his left ear down to his jawline, a souvenir from a life of violence. It was Elias Thorne. I recognized him from the security briefings Marcus ran on all Helios subcontractors. Elias wasn't an employee, he was a consultant. In the industry, we called men like him fixers. They were the ones you called when a union rep needed to be scared off or a building inspector needed to find an envelope of cash in his car. He was cleaning his fingernails with a knife. It wasn't a pocket knife, it was a tactical blade, matte black serrated. Just looking for the bathroom, I said, letting my voice waver. Must have taken a wrong turn. Big house. Elias chuckled. It was a wet, unpleasant sound. He didn't look up from his nails. Bathroom's the other way, Pops. This is where the big boys play. This is where the real work happens. He pointed the knife toward the door. Get out. Before you see something that confuses your little brain. I didn't move. My eyes darted to the desk. The red folder was 5 steps away. I needed a distraction. I needed to destabilize him. I looked at Elias. I looked at the way he sat, slouched, arrogant. I looked at his wrist. A heavy gold watch glinted in the lamplight. Is that a Rolex? I asked, stepping closer instead of retreating. Elias bristled. The question fed his ego. He sat up straighter, twisting his wrist to catch the light. Yeah, Submariner. Gold. Gift from the boss. Julian? I asked. Mr. Drake? Elias corrected. He knows how to treat his talent. I took another step. 4 steps to the desk. It's beautiful, I said. Then I dropped the mask. It's a shame about the bezel, though. Elias frowned. The knife stopped moving. What? The bezel? I said, my voice losing the tremble. It became clinical, precise. The Serichrome insert, the font on the 40 is slightly off, too thick. And the Cyclops lens over the date, it's magnifying at 1.582, not 2.582. I looked him in the eye. It's a fake, Elias. A Canal Street knockoff. Julian probably charged the company 10 grand for it and gave you a $50 toy. The silence in the room was absolute. Elias stared at me. Then he stared at the watch. Doubt, hot and angry, flashed across his face. Then rage. He stood up. He unfolded like a collapsing crane in reverse, towering over me. He was 6'4" easily. What did you say to me? He growled, stepping into my space. The smell of stale tobacco and aggression rolled off him. I said your boss thinks you're cheap, I replied calmly. I said he's playing you for a fool. You got a big mouth for a beggar, Elias hissed. He shoved me. It wasn't a playful push. It was a strike to the chest with a hand the size of a shovel. I was 60 years old. I was strong, but I wasn't immovable. I stumbled back, my boots catching on the edge of the Persian rug. I flailed, my arm striking a marble pedestal near the desk. Crash. A Ming vase, or a very expensive reproduction, shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound was explosive, like a gunshot in the quiet house. What the hell was that? Julian's voice shouted from the dining room, muffled but approaching fast. Elias froze. His eyes went wide. For a split second, the fixer was just a hired thug afraid of his master. You're dead, Elias hissed at me, pointing a finger. You broke it. Not yet, I whispered, while his eyes were on the door, while his brain was processing the mistake. I moved. I lunged for the desk. My hand, the hand that had laid bricks and poured concrete, snatched the red folder. In one fluid motion, I shoved it inside my jacket, pressing it flat against my ribs. I buttoned the jacket. The door burst open. Julian stood there, his face flushed with wine and anger. Lily and his parents were behind him, peering into the gloom. He broke the vase, Elias shouted immediately, pointing at me like a schoolyard tattletale. I caught him snooping. He was trying to steal something. Julian looked at the shattered porcelain. He looked at Elias, who was sweating. Then he looked at me. I was leaning against the desk, clutching my chest where Elias had shoved me, looking frail and winded. Did you touch the laptop? Julian asked softly. His voice was ice. He didn't care about the vase. He cared about the data. I shook my head, wheezing slightly. I was looking for the bathroom, I stammered. This man, he pushed me. Julian scanned the desk. The laptop was untouched. The pile of papers looked undisturbed. He didn't notice the missing red folder. He was too arrogant to keep an inventory of his crimes in his head. He looked at Elias with contempt. You pushed an old man. Elias? Really? He was running his mouth about the watch. Elias protested, sounding pathetic. Julian rolled his eyes. He relaxed. The threat was gone. In his eyes, I was just a clumsy, senile old man who had gotten lost. Get out, Julian said to me, pointing to the door. Go back to the table, sit down, and don't move until I tell you to. Yes, I whispered. I'm sorry. I limped past him. I walked past Lily, who looked terrified. I walked back into the hallway, clutching my chest. Under the wool of my suit, against my beating heart, the red folder felt burning hot. I had the smoking gun. Now I just needed to pull the trigger. I returned to the dining room, my steps heavy, playing the part of the chaste elder. The air in the room had curdled. The pretense of a celebratory dinner had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, aggressive silence. I sank back into my chair opposite Richard. He didn't look up. He was busy swirling his wine, staring into the vortex of the cheap liquid, as if searching for a reason to feel superior. Julian was already seated, his composure regained. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and irritation, like a man watching a fly crawl across a television screen. Sit, he commanded, though I was already seating myself. And don't touch anything else. You've done enough damage for one night. I placed my hands on my lap, under the tablecloth. My fingers found the cool, smooth surface of the red folder tucked inside my jacket. I cracked it open, just an inch, shielding the movement with the tablecloth. I glanced down. It wasn't just a spreadsheet. It was a wire transfer confirmation. Date October 14th. Amount $2,100,000. Origin, Helios Construction, Riverfront Materials Budget. Destination, Cayman Islands Holdings, LLC. He hadn't just cut corners on the concrete. He had stolen the money meant for the reinforcements and funneled it offshore. He had hollowed out the building's bones to pad his own retirement. A cold fury settled in my gut. It wasn't the anger of a boss. It was the rage of a builder. He had violated the sacred trust between a maker and the people who would live inside his creation. He was willing to let a building collapse, to let people die for a number on a screen. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket. I kept it below the table line. I typed a single message to Marcus. Text. Code red. Confirmed. Bring the cavalry. I pressed send. The phone vibrated once. A tiny heartbeat of confirmation. And then I slid it back into my pocket. What are you doing? Julian snapped. His eyes were hawk-like, missing nothing. Texting your bookie? Checking if your welfare check cleared? Just checking the time, I said softly. It's getting late. Time for you to leave? Eleanor suggested hopefully. Not quite yet, I said. I think the entertainment is just arriving. As if on cue, the front door opened. But it wasn't Marcus. A man walked in. He wore a rumpled beige suit that had seen better decades. His tie was loose, and his face was a map of broken capillaries and bad decisions. It was Detective Ray. I knew him, too. Not personally, but by reputation. He was a vice cop, who had been pushed down to property crimes, after a corruption inquiry that didn't quite stick. He was Julian's insurance policy. Ray walked into the dining room, his wet shoes squeaking on the hardwood. He looked around the opulent room with hungry eyes, taking in the crystal, the silver, the wealth. Julian, Ray nodded, forcing a familiarity that made Julian wince slightly. I got your text. I was in the neighborhood. Ray, Julian said, standing up and smoothing his tuxedo jacket. He pointed a finger at me. This is him. Ray turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were dead, transactional. He didn't see a person. He saw a favor he could trade later. This the guy? Ray asked, reaching for his belt. Yes, Julian said, his voice ringing with triumph. Trespassing. Destruction of private property. And, he paused, improvising. And I believe he attempted to steal a laptop from my study. My associate, Elias, witnessed it. What? Lily screamed. She shot up from her chair, knocking it over. That's a lie. Julian, what are you doing? I'm handling it, Lily, Julian said calmly, not looking at her. Your father is a thief and a vandal. I can't have that around us. Trespassing and attempted grand larceny. Ray recited, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked ominously. That's a felony. Come on, Pops. Stand up. Ray walked toward me. He moved with the slow, inevitable swagger of a bully who knows he has the badge to back him up. Don't touch him. Lily shouted. She threw herself between Ray and me. She was small, trembling, but she stood her ground. He didn't steal anything. He's my dad. Move, lady, Ray warned, his hand drifting toward his holster. Don't catch an obstruction charge. Lily, move, I said gently. I stood up. I didn't look at Ray. I looked at Julian. You really want to do this? I asked. Think carefully, Julian. Once the cuffs go on, the game changes. There is no going back. Julian laughed. It was a high, giddy sound. The game is already over, Arthur. You lost. You're going to jail, and tomorrow, Lily and I are going to have a very long talk about cutting toxic people out of her life. Cuff him, Ray, Julian ordered. Ray reached out. He grabbed my left arm, twisting it behind my back. Pain shot through my shoulder, the old rotator cuff injury flaring up. Stop. Lily was sobbing now. I wouldn't do that, I said. My voice dropped an octave. It became the voice of the earth itself. I looked past Ray toward the massive bay window overlooking the driveway. Why? Ray sneered, tightening his grip. You gonna cry? No, I said. Because of the dot. The what? Ray looked down at his own chest. There, directly over his heart, was a bright, steady red laser dot. He froze. Another dot appeared on Julian's forehead. A third on the wine decanter in front of Richard. The room went silent, the kind of silence that happens before an explosion. Crash. The tent door didn't just open, it was kicked in. The sound of splintering wood echoed like a cannon shot. Heavy boots thundered down the hallway. Police, state troopers. Nobody move. Voice after voice, overlapping, authoritative, deafening. Julian's face went white. Ray, what is this? Ray released my arm as if I were made of lava. He threw his hands up. I don't know. I didn't call them. Into the dining room marched 4 uniformed state troopers, their weapons drawn but lowered. Behind them walked a man in a black tactical raincoat, dripping wet. It was Marcus, my head of security. He scanned the room, his eyes assessing threats in milliseconds. He saw Ray. He saw Elias peering out from the kitchen. He saw Julian. Step away from Mr. Clay, Marcus ordered, his voice flat and hard. Ray backed away until he hit the wall. I didn't know. I was just... Drop the belt, Ray, one of the troopers barked. Julian was trembling. He looked from the troopers to Marcus. And then slowly, terrified, his eyes turned to me. Who are you people? Julian screamed, his voice cracking. This is private property. I am a director at Helios Construction. I brushed the wrinkles from my sleeve. I adjusted my lapels. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the red folder. I tossed it onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and stopped in front of Julian. I know who you are, Julian, I said. I stepped forward. The troopers parted for me. But you seem to be confused about who I am. The room was suspended in a vacuum of shock. The fire crackled in the other room, the only natural sound in a space dominated by artificial power. I looked at Julian. I stripped away the layers of his pretension, his expensive tuxedo, his title. I looked at the frightened boy underneath. My name, I said, my voice filling the room without shouting, is Arthur Clay. Julian blinked. So, we know that. Clay? I repeated. As in Clay and Associates, the parent company of Helios Construction. The parent company of Helios Construction. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of a chair to stay upright. No, he whispered. No, that's impossible. He's a billionaire. He's a myth. You're a bricklayer. I am a bricklayer, I agreed. I started laying bricks and I built Helios from a single pickup truck in a loan I couldn't afford. I built it with these hands. I held them up, showing him the scars again. The hands you laughed at. I pointed to the red folder, and I built it on a foundation of integrity. Something you know nothing about. That folder, I continued, contains proof of wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal negligence. You authorized the pouring of concrete on a liquefaction zone to save money, and you stole the difference. I turned to the troopers. Officer, take this into evidence. A trooper stepped forward and bagged the folder. Julian looked at Lily. Babe, tell him. Tell him he's crazy." Lily was staring at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears, but also with a dawning realization. The late nights I worked, the stress, the contracts I mentioned earlier, the pieces were fitting together. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, sweetie," I said, my voice softening only for her. "I wanted you to be loved for who you are, not for my money. I wanted you to find a man who respected the worker, not just the bank account." I looked back at Julian. "You failed that test, Julian, in every conceivable way." "Mr. Clay," Marcus stepped forward. "Detective Ray is in custody. Elias has been apprehended in the kitchen, attempting to flee." "Good," I said. I walked up to Julian. He was shaking violently now.
"I am a father," I said, "and I am a builder." I leaned in close. "And you are fired."
"Wait," Julian pleaded, reaching out. "Arthur, Mr. Clay, please. It was a mistake. I can fix it. The wedding. We're family." "We are not family," I said coldly. "And there will be no wedding." "Take him," I nodded to the troopers. They moved in. The click of handcuffs on Julian's wrists was the sweetest sound I had heard all night. He was weeping now, blubbering about his promotion, about his life. I turned to Eleanor and Richard. They were sitting in their chairs, frozen, their faces gray. "Mr. and Mrs. Drake," I said. Eleanor flinched. "My legal team has been looking into the title of this house," I said. "It seems Julian purchased it using the embezzled funds. That makes it a proceed of crime." Sarah, my corporate attorney, stepped in through the broken front door, shaking her umbrella. She handed me a document. "This house," I said, looking at the paper, "is now the property of Helios Construction, to recoup losses." I dropped the paper on Richard's plate, right on top of his steak. "You have 1 hour to vacate. Take your clothes. Leave the furniture." "You can't do this," Eleanor shrieked. "We are prominent people. You are squatters," I said. "Get out." I turned my back on them. I walked over to Lily. She was standing amidst the chaos, looking lost. "Dad?" she asked. "Is it true about the company?" "It's true," I said. I opened my arms. She collapsed into me. She cried, burying her face in the wool of my old suit. It smelled of rain and dust, but to her I hoped it smelled like safety. "I don't care about the money," she sobbed. "I really don't. I'm so sorry I let him treat you that way." "It's over now," I soothed her, stroking her hair. "The foundation was rotten, Lily. We had to tear it down so we could build something real." We walked out of the house, leaving the shouting and the police lights behind us. The rain had stopped. The air was crisp, clean, scrubbed of the humidity. We walked to my rusty 2004 Ford sedan. It looked small next to the police cruisers and the black SUVs of my security team. Marcus opened the back door of a luxury SUV for us, but I shook my head. "We'll take the truck," I said. Marcus smiled. "Yes, sir." I opened the passenger door for Lily. The hinges creaked loudly. She climbed in, wiping her eyes. I got in the driver's side. The engine started with that familiar rhythmic shudder. The vibration traveled up the seat and into my spine. It felt good. It felt honest. I put the car in gear. "Dad," Lily said, looking at me in the dim light of the dashboard. "Yeah, honey?" She reached out and touched the fabric of my sleeve, right over the mend Martha had made all those years ago. "I love this suit," she said softly. I looked down at the charcoal gray wool, the wide lapels, the dust of the evening. "Me too, honey," I smiled, and this time it reached my eyes. It wasn't trash. It was history. It was honor. It was the uniform of a man who built things to last. And tonight it was victory. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers faded in the rearview mirror, shrinking until they were nothing more than distant, frantic fireflies against the black backdrop of the night. Inside the Ford, the silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the drive to the mansion. It was the exhausted, hollow silence of a battlefield after the cannons have stopped firing. The adrenaline that had sustained me, that sharp chemical clarity, began to drain away. In its wake, it left a profound ache in my joints. My shoulder throbbed where the rain had soaked through. My knees felt like rusted hinges. I suddenly felt every minute of my 60 years. I glanced over at Lily. She was staring out the window, watching the rain streak horizontally across the glass. She had stopped crying, but her face was pale, illuminated intermittently by the yellow glare of streetlights. She looked shattered. Not just heartbroken, but fundamentally shaken. Her reality had been dismantled in the span of an hour. "Are you hungry?" I asked. My voice sounded scrapier than usual. She shook her head. "No, I think I'm going to be sick, actually. We need coffee," I decided. "And pie. Bad pie. The kind that sits in your stomach like a brick." She managed a weak, watery smile, like the stuff Mom used to buy from the grocery store bakery. Exactly like that, I pulled the Ford into the parking lot of Sal's Diner, a neon-lit beacon of grease and caffeine that had stood on Route 9 since before I laid my first foundation. We sat in a booth with red vinyl seats that were cracked and taped over with duct tape. It was a far cry from the mahogany and silk of the Drake mansion. It smelled of frying bacon and floor wax. To me, it smelled like heaven. A waitress named Barb, who had been working there since the Reagan administration, poured us 2 mugs of black coffee without asking. She didn't look at my suit or Lily's cocktail dress. She just saw 2 people who needed something hot. "Dad," Lily said, wrapping her hands around the mug for warmth. She didn't look up. "How long did you know?" I sighed. I took a sip of the coffee. It was scaldingly hot and bitter. "About the money? Since Tuesday. About him." I paused. I knew he was small the moment I met him, Lily, but I wanted to be wrong. "For you. I feel so stupid," she whispered. "He played me. He used me to get close to the company, to get to you. You aren't stupid," I said firmly. I reached across the chipped laminate table and covered her hand with mine. My hand was rough, stained, and scarred. Hers was smooth. "You are trusting. You have a good heart. Never apologize for that. The world needs people like you, or else it's just people like me and Julian eating each other alive. But he called you a beggar," she said, her voice cracking again. "He humiliated you." "He tried to," I corrected, "but insult only sticks if you respect the person throwing it. And I didn't respect him enough to be insulted." I looked down at my suit. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner, the wear was even more visible. The fraying threads, the shine on the elbows. "You know why I wear this?" I asked. Lily looked at the suit. "Because Mom liked it? That's part of it," I said. "But it's also a reminder. When I bought this suit, we had just landed the contract for the municipal hospital. We were celebrating. I felt like a king." I ran my thumb over the mend on the cuff, but 2 days later I was back on site. A cable snapped. I jumped in to pull a kid out of the way. An apprentice. I ripped the suit. "I saved the kid. I didn't know that," Lily said softly. I came home, and I was furious. I ruined my expensive new suit. Martha, she just laughed. I closed my eyes, summoning the memory. It was clearer than the diner around me. "It's just wool, Arthur," she had said. "You saved a life. The tear is the best part of the suit. It's the story." I opened my eyes. "Julian saw a torn suit and thought poverty," I said. "I see the tear and I remember what matters. People matter. Safety matters. Doing the work matters. I kept the money separate from us, Lily, because I wanted you to build your own character. I didn't want you to be like them." Lily looked at me, really looked at me. She saw the billionaire CEO. Yes. But mostly she saw the bricklayer. "I think I'm done with fancy weddings," she said, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Oh? Yeah, when I get married again," she said. "I think I want a backyard thing. BBQ. Maybe some of those guys from your crew can play guitar." "Sounds loud," I grumbled, hiding a smile. "And cheap." "Exactly," she said. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence. The storm outside had finally broken. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, ready to go home. I asked. "To the big house?" she asked, teasing me about my secret life. "No," I said, dropping a $20 bill on the table for a $3 coffee. "To the cabin. The heater rattles, but the roof is solid." We walked out to the car. The air was cold and fresh. I opened the door for her, and she climbed in. I stood for a moment by the driver's side, looking up at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing a few stubborn stars. I touched the lapel of my charcoal gray suit one last time. "We did good, Martha," I whispered to the night. "We did good." I got into the car, turned the key, and felt the rough, rhythmic shudder of the engine vibrate through my spine. It wasn't a perfect machine. It had miles on it. It had scars. But it ran, and that was enough.